Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this evening's program. We are very excited to have you here with us. Just some quick housekeeping issues before we begin. We have a great upcoming program, our first in-person program, and that will be taking place on April 25th. It is a book discussion of the women of Copper County, as well as a virtual presentation with some of our friends up north who will fill us in on the real life stories of the women in Copper County and the Jewish women in Copper County. And also please save the date for our JHSM annual meeting, Sunday, June 12th at 10:30 a.m. This evening we have with us Professor Pamela Nadell, who holds the Patrick Clenenden Chair in Women's and Gender History at American University, where she directs the Jewish Studies program and received the university's highest award, Scholar Teacher of the Year. Her books include Women Who Would Be Rabbis, A History of Women's Ordination, 1889 to 1985, and her most recent book, America's Jewish Women, A History from Colonial Times to Today. And this book won the 2019 National Jewish Book Award for the Jewish Book of the Year. She is currently writing a book about the history of American anti-Semitism to be published in 2025 by W.W. Norton, and will be speaking about anti-Semitism with us this evening. Please be sure to hold all of your questions till the end of the program, and then we will have a question and answer session, which I will moderate, and we will do that. If you could submit them via the chat feature, that would be great. And now, without further ado, Pamela Nadell.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kara. I so appreciate this wonderful invitation, and my thanks to the Jewish Historical Society of Michigan for sponsoring this evening's program. I'm going to start by sharing my screen so you can see where we are. And I want to, I think you have to be living in a cave not to think that anti-Semitism has been rising in our own moment in time. So let me start by showing you a few images of what I mean. This was the Chabad Center at the University of Delaware, on fire in the August of 2020, and it was set on fire. It was an arson attack. In April of 2021, there were 6 anti-Semitic attacks at 4 synagogues in this metropolitan area of New York, just in 1 month. In July of 2021, maybe some of you remember reading about this in the paper, there was a swastika etched into the elevator at the State Department, and it was etched into the elevator that closest to the office of what would have then become the office of Deborah Lipstadt, who has now been named ambassador to monitor and combat anti-Semitism. So she wasn't in that office yet, nobody was, but she just got confirmed. And of course, we have here the hostage taking at the synagogue in Colleyville in Texas on January 15th, 2022. So these are kind of the really large events that we all know about. But if you're interested in anti-Semitism, as I am, I actually get a daily news feed of anti-Semitic incidents, and it's horrific. There is not a day that goes by without my having to click on a list of about 10 different ones, and a couple that pop out that are happening in the United States, as well as, of course, the ones around the world. And so it won't surprise you to know that this is a list of anti-Semitic incidents that the Anti-Defamation League has charted since they've been keeping a record in 1979. And you can see that the past couple of years are the absolute peak in terms of anti-Semitic incidents. In 2020, there was a total of 2,024 incidents of assault, harassment, and vandalism reported to the Anti-Defamation League. And I want to emphasize the word reported, because we know that many, many incidents never go reported. That people decide they're not serious enough, There are all sorts of reasons why somebody doesn't take that step to actually report an incident. And we also know, as Kara and I were just discussing before, that events that are happening in Israel definitely impact what happens in anti-Semitism in the United States. Because here you can see on this chart, you can see the line of anti-Semitic incidents in May of 2020, but then during the Gaza conflict of May of 2021, you can see how they virtually doubled in the United States. So there are so many people out there talking about anti-Semitism. I could give you all sorts of names and recent books that have been written, but I'm a historian, and so I'm interested in our understanding what this contemporary anti-Semitism is resting on in terms of our nation's past. So for historians, the big question when studying anti-Semitism, and frankly other questions as well, it's the big question, is America different? So if your standard for anti-Semitism is the murderous rampages of the pogroms and the Holocaust, of course, the answer is America is different. And I recommend this terrific new book to you by Wendy Lauer. It just won a National Jewish Book Award in the category of Holocaust. And in this book, she deconstructs this photo. It's one of the very, very rare photos that exist of the actual moment of killing in the Ukraine. And this is a really big but, because the idea that anti-Semitism is minimal in the US rests on the notion that America is this shining city on a hill. We call this American exceptionalism. The idea that the immigrants who came here, they forged out of their diverse cultures this brand new nation. They created a democracy, and that it was a dramatic departure from the old world. And if that's true, then you would think that anti-Semitism always played a negligible role in America, unlike in Europe, and that it rarely turned violent. But the problem is, if you know your American history, there are examples of violence in the American past. I'll just give you a few. In 1902, when a man who had been named the chief rabbi of New York, Rabbi Jacob Joseph, during his funeral, people didn't pay so much attention to him in his life, but thousands and thousands turned out for his funeral. And when they passed under a factory where Irish workers were working, a riot broke out attacking the funeral. In 1928, in Messina, New York, when a little girl disappeared, it happened to have been she disappeared on the Saturday before the Sunday when Yom Kippur would start that Sunday evening. And so she had wandered into the woods. Her mother sent her to find her brother. He came loping out. They couldn't find her. And as they searched all night and into the next morning, they started saying, well, maybe the Jews did it. They have a holiday coming up. Fortunately, the little girl found her way out of the woods. She had fallen asleep. But even that night, when the Jews of Messina, New York, went to synagogue for Kol Nidre prayers, they had to wade through a crowd, an angry crowd of their neighbors. There have also in American history been bombings of synagogues, Jewish community centers, and rabbis' homes in the South. This gives you an example of one of the homes. So in the 1950s and the 1960s, there were at least 8 bombings that succeeded between 1957 and 1958 alone. 2 occurred on the same day, on March 16th. A Jewish community center in Nashville, Tennessee was bombed, and earlier that day, a synagogue in Miami Beach, Florida had been bombed. And so these examples show us that it's not on the scale of the pogroms, but it is definitely on the scale of the leaning. If you think of anti-Semitism as running on a spectrum, violence has broken out on American soil, and not just recently, but in the past. So I want to use our limited time today to go back in time. And I'm going to go all the way back to Governor Peter Stuyvesant. Maybe some of you have heard his name. He was the governor of New Amsterdam, a colony that was owned by the Dutch West India Company. And sometime at the very end of August or the beginning of September 1654, 23 poor Jews landed in New Amsterdam. They had fled the Inquisition that was about to begin operating in Recife, Brazil. And they had been allowed to leave. They made their way to this new American colony. And within 2 weeks, Governor Stuyvesant was writing a letter asking the company that owned the colony and saying to them, this deceitful race, such hateful enemies and blasphemers of the name of Christ, they need to be allowed in a friendly way to depart the colony. And he went on, not only did he want to kick them out, but he said, they were also usurers. He was talking about 23 refugees who were so poor they had to sell their belongings to pay the ship's captain. But he was dredging up that old medieval stereotype of the Jews as greedy moneylenders. And he also used language that said by kicking them out, they would not be allowed further to infect and trouble this new colony. And we know that also a medieval stereotype is that the Jews carry contagion, they carry disease. So from the moment the first Jews in America landed, my argument is that anti-Semitism proved itself as an American tradition. And I'm going to skip over, in interest of time, I'm going to jump right to the Civil War, but I could, if you wanted, I could, in the Q&A, we could definitely talk about other examples before the Civil War. So the most famous incident of anti-Semitism on American soil up until 1860s is this event during the Civil War. Eras of anxiety, of disappointment, of insecurity, they stoke anti-Semitism. And that's an observation that applies to our own moment in time. So you wouldn't be surprised to know that during the horrors of the Civil War, anti-Semitism surged in America, both in the North, in the Union, and in the South, in the Confederacy. And Ulysses S. Grant issued an order in 1862 expelling the Jews as a class from his military district. The stunning thing about the expulsion is that by and large it didn't affect that many Jews, because Jews rallied immediately to ride to Washington and to compel Lincoln to rescind the order. Nevertheless, it affected some Jews. 2 dying women had to be left behind in care of a neighbor because their families had been expelled. And although Lincoln countermanded the order fairly quickly, it left a legacy of a successful expulsion of the Jews on American soil. And of course, again, an echo of the history of expulsions of Jews, like the great one from Spain in 1492. These are also the years when, because of the crisis, some people come up with a new way of solving the problem of the crisis. They decide that the reason God has punished the nation with a civil war is because the people of the United States have not recognized God and Jesus Christ in the preamble to the Constitution. And so they introduced an amendment to the Constitution saying, we, the people of the United States, recognizing the being and attributes of the Almighty God, the divine authority of Holy Scripture, the law of God as paramount rule, and Jesus, the Messiah, the Savior, the Lord of all, in order to form a more perfect union. And then they continue with the original text. This is not a momentary attempt. The organization that promoted the Christian Amendment at the end of the 19th century, a former Supreme Court justice was its head, and there would be efforts to amend the Constitution to recognize God and Jesus well down into several decades of the 20th century. In fact, the Civil War sets the stage because after 1865, after the horrors of the Civil War, we see that a full-fledged anti-Semitic society emerges in the United States. Think about what had happened. The war left probably 750,000 Americans dead. That's actually the most current figure. It's been revised upward from what many of you might have been taught in school at one point. It left myriads of women widowed and orphaned, their sons gone, and myriads of children as orphans. The South was destroyed. And then in 1873, a panic hit America. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of the Panic of 1873, but for the next half century, they called it the Great Depression. But while all this is happening, American Jews are taking up more space than ever before on urban streets. They're building opulent synagogues like this one. This is actually the Plum Street Synagogue from Cincinnati. It cost more than $4 million in 21st century dollars to build. It was dedicated right after the war in 1866. And at the same time, more and more poor Jews are taking up space on American streets. The US population increased dramatically between 1860 and 1880. The Jewish population increased somewhere between 50 and 100%. And that's because of more and more Jews were coming who were from Eastern Central Europe, they were from Eastern Europe, and they were Yiddish speaking, they dressed differently, and their neighborhoods were called ghettos. At the same time, something else that is roiling Americans is that they're being challenged both by how to absorb the newly freed African American men and women, and also by the ongoing challenges of the women's rights movement. So there's so much at play in this period. And so it's important to understand how anti-Semitism rises against this backdrop of these challenges to what we're seeing as, maybe you can say, traditional American values like that had preceded the Civil War, like slavery. So how do we see this anti-Judaism manifested? And if you notice, I was very careful now. I use the word anti-Judaism because the word anti-Semitism hasn't been coined yet. It's not coined until 1879. So one of the places that we really see it is that, forget about the Constitution, but America was very much a Christian country, and Protestantism was the only true religion. There's tremendous anti-Catholicism in these years. These school books, the McGuffey's Readers, which were created before the Civil War in the 1830s, but would eventually, I forget the year, but there would be millions and millions of copies of the McGuffey Readers well into the 20th century. And these were what were used to teach children how to read, because they were, remember when you were in school and like in first grade, maybe you read from a purple book, and in second grade you read from a red book. So here, these were the first series of graduated readers for teaching children to read. This happens to be Henry Ford's collection. He collected these. We're going to come to him in a little bit. And the message of the McGuffey Readers was that salvation could only be achieved through Jesus Christ. You have to remember, in these years, how did the school day begin? It began with the Lord's Prayer. It began with readings from the Bible, and mostly those readings were from the New Testament. And on the week before Easter would come, the week we happen to be in now, the teachers would, of course, read the story of Jesus's death, of his passion. And children who grew up to write memoirs, Jewish children who grew up to write about what happened, would talk about how, then they would start to get yelled names on the playground, or they would get beaten up on the playground in the week before Easter. So the opening salvo, often called the opening salvo in this era of rising anti-Semitism, was the Seligman Affair. Joseph Seligman was a banker who knew Lincoln, was a friend of Grant's, the presidents Lincoln and Grant. And for about a decade, every summer, he would leave New York City and he would go to take the waters in Saratoga Springs, New York, and they would stay at the Grand Union Hotel. But in 1877, under new management, the hotel decided it didn't want any more Israelites, as they were called. And Seligman was turned away, Seligman and his family, and it became a national sensation. Now, the reality is Jews already knew for more than a decade that there were many places of public accommodation they could not stay. But to see Seligman being turned away, to see his civil rights being violated in this fashion, helped launch this rising anti-Semitism of these years. And it spread. The opposition to Jews spread to Coney Island, at Manhattan Beach and Coney Island. Austin Corbin, the owner of its hotel, he decided that he would not admit any Jews. This was 1879, and somebody produced this cartoon. It comes from a magazine called Puck in 1879, and it's called Hints for the Jews, Several Ways of Getting to Manhattan Beach. And you can see, the nice thing about Zoom is you can see the images close up, so maybe it's not so hard to see, but you can see that, what do we have? We have a band of people who are depicted as stereotypically Jewish, and they're getting right past the Corbin because he can't see that they're Jews coming in, and so he needs music for his hotel. Or maybe you can see that the person who's at this contraption that looks like a rack or a guillotine, and parabolic noses are being trimmed at the guillotine. Kinky hair must positively be straightened by order of Corbin. And then if you look really carefully, it's a little hard to see, but if you look at, let me see if I can show you with the arrow over there, this family, they're clearly a Jewish family, again, because of the stereotype. And what they're doing is they're signing to say that they will partake of the fare that is being served to eat there. And the menu is ham sandwiches and pig's cheek and bacon. So Corbin joined with the leaders of the hotel in Saratoga Springs, the Grand Union. And in 1879, they held a meeting. They founded the American Society for the Suppression of Jews. Now, I'm not saying this was was very, very influential by any means, but I want you to hear what they voted, that they agreed, what their platform was. They resolved not to elect Jews to public office, not to attend theaters where Jewish composers wrote the music or Jewish actors performed, not to buy or read books by Jews, not to ride on Jewish-owned railroads, not to do business with Jewish-owned insurance companies. And so we get this sense of anti-Semitism, and it's not, I want you to understand, it's not being directed at the poor East European Jewish immigrants. It's being directed at Jews who were born here, whose parents sometimes were born here, who were educated here, and who were seen as well-to-do. And let me show you a couple of other images that show some of these concerns. So this is called The Dream of the Jews Realized. And you can see that John Smith and Dry Goods, that's been in business since 1820, that sign is being taken down, and Moses Eckstein's sign is being put up. And if you look at the images that are portrayed here, it's not the East European immigrant Jews. It's seen as these kind of nouveau riche Jews. And what are they doing? They're taking over New York. And this is not the only image that we have showing this. So when you think of contemporaries who in Charlottesville in 2017 chanted, "Jews will not replace us," they don't know that they're chanting a very old trope, but now we know it. We also see that Jews come across in some of these images as sexually licentious. Here is a Jewish shopkeeper. He's got his three buddies behind him, and they are preying on the cream of American womanhood and taking them into their factories. And Jews are also charged with economic manipulation. Look at the two figures on the outside here. What are they doing? They are stereotypically Jews, and they are reenacting the crucifixion, but they're crucifying Uncle Sam. The real impact of this, of excluding Jews from places of public accommodation, hotels, dance halls, tennis and golf clubs, swimming pools, apartment buildings, neighborhoods, schools, there was a real impact that Jews felt and they wrote about. And I'm not going to talk about the articles that a couple of them wrote at the end of the 19th century, but if you want, we can talk about it later. So when we move past the end of the 19th century, the years between World War I and World War II are typically considered the high tide of American anti-Semitism. And it opens with the trial of Leo Frank. On Confederate Memorial Day in Atlanta in 1913, a 13-year-old girl, Mary Fagan, went to the pencil factory where she worked for just pennies an hour to pick up her pay from the factory superintendent, Leo Frank. Leo Frank was a college-educated Northerner that was actually born in Texas, but he was an outsider to the South. And around 3 a.m. on Sunday morning, April 27th, 1913, the night watchman, Newt Lee, had gone to the basement to use the toilet that was designated for African Americans in that factory. And he found Mary Fagan's mutilated body. Suspicion soon fell on Frank. Frank maintained his innocence, but newspapers, yellow journalism if you want, inflamed the trial. The trial was an absolute circus. It was rife with accusations of Frank's sexuality, of him molesting the factory girls, and it was rife with anti-Semitism. In fact, what's so stunning is that when I was doing research for this book, I found a letter that his mother wrote, Lucille Frank. No, Lucille was his wife, Mrs. Ray Frank. That's how she signed it. Mrs. Ray Frank wrote to the Washington Post, and in it she talks about the slanders, the innuendos against her son's faith at the trial, and then she calls for, where is the American Zola who will save my son? She's referring to Émile Zola, the French writer whose actions, whose words blew open the Dreyfus Affair that ultimately led to Dreyfus's not only pardon, but exoneration. But there was no Émile Zola for Dreyfus. He was convicted. He was, for Frank. He was convicted. He was sentenced to death. And then his sentence was commuted because the governor of Georgia became increasingly convinced, as had one of the attorneys involved in the case, that a gross miscarriage of justice had been held. And so Governor John Slayton commuted Frank's sentence to life imprisonment. But these were his words. 2,000 years ago, another governor washed his hands and turned over a Jew to a mob. For 2,000 years, that governor's name has been accursed. If today another Jew were lying in his grave because I had failed to do my duty, I would all through life find his blood on my hands and would consider myself an assassin through cowardice. And so the governor commuted his sentence on the day he was to have been executed. And then shortly thereafter, a mob of 25 leading citizens of Marietta, Georgia, including, by the way, the Solicitor General, whose job it was to enforce the law, went to the jail where Frank was being held, and without firing a shot, took him out and lynched him. The aftermath of Frank's trial was so powerful in terms of anti-Semitism. First of all, Frank's actually his arrest led to the founding of the Anti-Defamation League, which was then called the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith. Some scholars estimate that half of the Jews in Georgia fled in the wake of Frank's trial. This was also sparking the founding of the Second Ku Klux Klan. And that Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, which was stronger in the North in places like Indiana than in the South, targeted Jews. And it would lead ultimately also to continuing to seek the exoneration of Frank. But I want you to remember this. Frank was convicted on the testimony of an African-American ex-convict named Jim Conley. And it was in fact Conley's lawyer who became increasingly convinced that his client was lying, and who then began to work to secure Frank's pardon and certainly exoneration. And in the South, only a Jew could be convicted on the testimony of an African American. No one else who appeared white could have been convicted by that testimony. So these take us then a little bit further into the 1920s. So Frank's trial was and murder were between 1913 and 1915. So after the end of World War I, Henry Ford, the most influential, best-known leader, business mogul, he actually ran for president of the United States. Ford played a major role in disseminating the notorious forgery, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This is the most influential anti-Semitic tract ever concocted. It is, purports that it is a grand conspiracy theory that the Jews meet every 100 years. They're plotting how they have taking over the world. The rise of liberalism has enabled them to destroy the church, the nobility, the sanctity of marriage. And so the protocols, which still circulate today, in March of 2021, a U.S. Police officer working at the United States Capitol in Washington, D.C., was suspended after a copy of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was found at his workstation. So the protocols were created around 1903. They were brought to the West and then to America in the late 19-teens after the end of the war. And Ford published them in his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, as part of a 93-week-long series that he called The International Jew, the World's Problem. He had such an enormous reach that hundreds of thousands of copies of this newspaper circulated around America. First of all, they were given out in every Ford motor dealership. So if you went in and you bought a Ford, you walked out with a copy of the Protocols. He had them mailed to 757 college presidents, to every member of Congress. In fact, they reached all the way into Germany. Just get that. So in March of 1923, a young German politician who had not yet tried to overthrow the Weimar Republic, which he would do in Hitler's Munich, the title of a new book by my colleague Michael Brenner, which I recommend very, very strongly. Adolf Hitler gave an interview to a Chicago Tribune reporter, and he says here that he admires Ford, especially his anti-Jewish policies, and in fact, Hitler would have liked to have sent some of his shock troops to America to help Ford. So what does this lead to? Because these are just the Frank trial and Ford, these are just two examples. So if you could see this headline, Lowell tells Jews limited colleges might help them. By the 1920s, we have quotas in colleges and universities coming in, and they will eventually come in all over America. We will see signs that will say Christians only, or Gentiles only, Jews not allowed. Sometimes they'll say Jews not allowed, dogs not allowed. One the sign with the woman in front of it, that's from a beach somewhere in Maryland. We get want ads saying no Jews apply, Gentiles only. We'll get restrictive covenants. Restrictive covenants will say no Jews. Actually, interesting one I read recently. It says no Jews, no Armenians, no Syrians, no Persians are allowed to buy a home in this particular section of Washington, D.C. How do Jews respond to these things? One of the things they do in the 20s and 30s, and actually all the way into the 50s and even somewhat in the 60s, is they change their names. This is a wonderful book called A Rosenberg by Any Other Name, showing that to avoid the restrictions, to the subterfuge of getting around these policies, which were enforceable for a very long time. The laws changing their enforceability will only fall much later. They changed their names. By the way, they also changed their noses. So rhinoplasties become quite popular. These are also years, especially in the 30s, when Nazi sympathizers in the United States create tremendous trouble for American Jews, so much so that, just to give you one example, in Los Angeles, they had a plan to kidnap 25 leading Jews, hang them, and hoped that that would start a nationwide pogrom. So anti-Semitism doesn't disappear in America after World War II. This is the recent example, but I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to tell you about a few others. So for example, that there have been recently swastika daubings at cemeteries, on synagogues. Well, vandalism of American Jewish cemeteries and synagogues dates to the colonial period. And in 1960, there was a worldwide epidemic of swastika daubings that started in Europe. It was actually inspired by the Soviets, and it made its way all the way to America. So when we get to today, we move up to our own period. Words like cities, names like Charlottesville, Pittsburgh, Poway, Jersey City, Muncie, and now Colleyville, those place names have for us become metonyms in the Jewish world for attacks on Jews. What is difficult to grapple with is that what do Americans know about this history? In 2020, the Pew Research Center reported what I consider to be an astonishing figure of 84% of American adults can identify the word Holocaust, and they know that it refers to the death and the persecution of Jews by the Nazis. Given the fact that Americans, by and large, are fairly ignorant of their history, there are always all these really fun surveys that are done that just get where Americans by and large get everything wrong. I find that an astonishing statistic. It shows actually that there has been extraordinary success in the United States around Holocaust education. More than 20 states mandate the teaching of the Holocaust. There are Holocaust museums and memorials dotting the landscape of the United States, from ones as large as the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in the nation's capital on the National Mall, to a tiny one in Newport News, Virginia, where there's a very small Jewish community. So when Americans talk about anti-Semitism, they think of the Holocaust. They think they are talking about an old world problem, not a new world problem. Or if they think it's a new world problem, they think, well, it just cropped up recently because they can name the cities that I named a minute ago. But my talk this evening about American anti-Semitism, showing that it has a long history in this nation, is, I think, really important for us to understand that this history is rarely recognized, little told, and it is a story of our past that is also, so sadly today, the story of our present. So thank you, and I hope we're going to have a lot of questions and good discussion.
Thank you very much. Just a reminder for everybody, if you could submit your questions via the chat feature, we will get them answered for you. And that chat feature is located at the bottom of your screen. I see there's a hand raised, but if you could just submit whatever question you have via the chat feature instead of raising the hand, since we are in a webinar, that will allow us to answer your question. We'll just give it one more minute if there are any questions. Again, I see that there's a hand raised, but if you could submit the question via the chat feature, that would be great. All right, well, as I don't see any questions coming through, I will go ahead. Oh, there we go. Where do we go from here?
I see one was Leo Frank's name.
And was Leo Frank's name
Yeah.
ever?
So Leo Frank's name was never cleared. He was he's never been exonerated. He was, I think, don't quote me on this, but I think what happened was he was given a posthumous pardon on the grounds that the state had failed to protect his civil rights and secure his safety in the prison. But he has never been, I'm positive he's never been exonerated. But every time like a large number comes around in terms of the anniversary of his execution, there in Atlanta, there's very powerful memories around Leo Frank. In fact, I remember when I was working on my book, America's Jewish Women, I remember reading about a woman who was from Atlanta, but had kept a diary after she moved to Florida. And in her diary, like in, 20 years later, she was writing, today is the anniversary of Leo Frank's death, that it sent a chill across American Jewry, and showed, I mean, that trial is about a lot of things. It's about tensions. And frankly, it's about the Civil War. It's about tensions between the North and the South. But anti-Semitism overlays that trial. So we did have a question about where do we go from here. This is such a tough issue. I don't know if you're familiar with the Pew Research Center's thermometer scale. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of this, but the Pew Research Center periodically surveys Americans to find out how they feel about different religious groups. And so they call it their thermometer scale. And the warmest feelings and the top of the scale are the Jews, that more Americans feel favorably towards Jews than they do towards other American religious groups. So what we have in the United States is we have what I'm calling a tradition of anti-Semitism. It's by no means embraced by all Americans, but we're in a very tough moment because it's hitting American Jews from the right and from the left. So from the right, it takes terrifying violent forms, and we have no way of knowing how many potential attacks on Jewish targets have been thwarted by various agencies that really monitor these things. But, I mean, I can tell you, my kids went to a Jewish day school, and I know that every morning in that day school, that there are people who patrol it with dogs, bomb sniffing dogs, and have done so for years, not just because of where we are now. But we are also experiencing really terrible anti-Semitism coming from the left. And the left claims that they're not anti-Semitic. They claim that they are pro-Palestinian and that they are opposed to Israel, that Israel, they have typed Israel as a settler colonialist society. And but what we see in this turn against Israel, which also, by the way, has real deep roots in American history. Nobody remembers the tensions around Israel that came from the African American community during the civil rights movement, especially at the time of the Six-Day War. Nobody remembers the anti-Semitism that surfaced in the women's movement, the international women's movement in the 1970s and 80s, when at these United Nations conferences that were held around the world, they said all those Jewish women in the leadership of the American feminist movement, like Bella Abzug and Betty Friedan, they gave that movement a bad name. Nobody remembers how at one of those conferences, when Leah Rabin, the wife of Yitzhak Rabin, I don't think he was prime minister then, but I'd have to double check, maybe he was. When she got up to speak, half the audience walked out. The African nations, the Asian nations, obviously the communist nations who were represented there. So people don't remember that, but the progressive animosity towards Israel is really affecting our young people, my students. They want to join an organization on campus. They want to join an environmental organization, or they want to join a women's organization or LGBTQ organization. But they're told that because they support the state of Israel, and the Pew Research Center tells us that the overwhelming majority of American Jews feel strongly supportive of the existence of the state of Israel, that they can't join those organizations because they are told they have to make a choice. They can either stand up for Israel or they can stand up for the environment. There's no place for them in these organizations. And that has become a very serious problem on the college campuses. I think this week, actually maybe today and tomorrow, the Hillel International and the American Jewish Committee have convened a meeting where 40 college and university presidents are attending to talk about anti-Semitism on the campus. And I have to tell you, I never thought, I've been teaching for 40 years at American University, I never thought I would be talking about anti-Semitism on the campus.
If there are any other questions, please submit them via the chat feature. I do have one. I know you're saying that a lot of these students are forced to choose. Which identity, for lack of a better way to term it, are they choosing? Are they choosing to be the environmentalist, or are they choosing to identify with the Jewish part of their identity and stand up for Israel?
So I think it's probably both. I think we don't have any clear-cut way of measuring it. I hear from the students who are heartbroken about about what's happened. So students who have strong Jewish identities and are saying, I can't, I'm not going to abandon Israel. So those are the cases that tend to make the news, and those are the ones that, I tend to see. Those who mask their Jewish identities, just the way, by the way, Jews in the 1930s masked their identities by changing their names and their noses, I'm less likely to hear from them.
So I've sort of termed that when I discuss it with my children, that we can almost hide in plain sight. Are you seeing more Jewish students sort of hiding in plain sight?
I think Jewish students have long hidden in plain sight. So I can't quantify it. There was all right, let me say this about the college campus. Over 90% of American Jewish kids go to college. Most of them go to actually a pretty small group of around 50 colleges and universities that they tend to, that's Jewish kids, Jewish parents want to send their kids to those places, and that's where they end up. The overwhelming majority of Jewish kids on campus are fine, but they may encounter anti-Semitism. Now, sometimes they encounter it from the casual remark. I mean, I'll give you All right, I'll give you an example that literally happened to my daughter last week. My daughter is a resident in surgery at the Brigham in Boston, and a nurse, one of the nurse practitioners, turned to her and said, "I don't want to go talk to those effing Jewish parents." And she saw my daughter's face, and then she backed off. And she knew my daughter was Jewish, and then she said, "I don't want to go talk to those effing Cohens," because their name was actually Cohen. Wasn't, I just masked it, but it was an identifiable Jewish name. And so my daughter said, "How am I supposed to react to that?" And I said, "Well, would she have said, 'I don't want to go talk to those effing Smiths'?" And she said, "No, she wouldn't do that." But is she going to report the nurse practitioner? No. Is that going to be reported to the Anti-Defamation League? No. It's so students on campus, I think, encounter these kinds of crass moments of conflict. And I dealt with a student who had this from her roommate earlier this past year. But you have to kind of decide, where are you going to fight? What's going to be, and sort of that question, where do we go from here? What battle are you going to pick? The anti-Semitism coming from the right is much more dangerous. There's no question about it. It's violent. And they really would like to see all Jews subordinated and kicked out of the United States. Frankly, they would like them all to go to Israel. The anti-Semitism that comes from the left is disturbing, but it's not scary in the same way. Although sometimes it is. Sometimes when you see a crowd cheering, when somebody says, as you and I were discussing earlier, when a speaker on campus says that he wants to see Palestine from the river to the sea, and he doesn't care what happens to the Israelis, and he's essentially calling for genocide, and the crowd cheers, that's scary. And that's a crowd that's on the left. So I don't know where to go from here. I'm a historian. I can look to the past. I don't know what's going to happen in the future. I never thought we would live in a moment with anti-Semitism that I think, frankly, historians in the future are going to look at this period and say that this is the high tide of American anti-Semitism, not the era between World War I and World War II.
Just give everyone a minute if there are any other questions. I'm not seeing any questions come through. Thank you so much, Professor Nadell, for this presentation tonight. It was so insightful and really gave a look, I think, at anti-Semitism historically that many of us may have not seen before. For everybody else, we hope that you will join us for one of our upcoming programs. We appreciate you being here tonight, and we hope to see you all very soon. Thank you so much, everyone. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good night.